Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Neural, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Before we get into the interview, I want to let you know about the Neural board community. One of my favourite elements is the Neural Mastermind, a safe haven for board members to discuss challenges and opportunities with peers. As an observer, I've been struck by how valuable it is to just listen to these discussions, which often make me more aware of my own blind spots as a board member. It was this realization that catalyzed the launch of the Neural Board Community Discussion Forum, where members can seek advice and share experiences on pressing challenges and opportunities openly or anonymously. I always loved the idea of being able to tap into the hive mind of the Neural board community and get its best thinking, of tapping into its network to open stubbornly closed doors. Well, now you can. Recent popular discussions include how to reconcile CEO board differences about a chair candidate. How do I manage conflicts of interest as I go plural? What can I do to get our new CEO up and running as quickly as possible? And how to be a good investor director. If you want to know what's top of mind for your board colleagues, or get help with a challenge you're wrestling with, or open a door for you or one of your boards at the click of a button, you can try the community for free for 30 days. As well as discussion threads, you'll benefit from smart online networking, one-to-one career guidance with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.neural.com to find out more. Today's guest, Priya Guha MBE, is a venture partner at Merian Ventures, a VC firm, and Ned at Herald Investment Trust, Digital Catapult, the UK innovation agency for advanced digital technology, and Reach plc, a media firm, and chair of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry in the UK. She's also a member of the Investment Governance Board at Future Planet Capital, another VC, and advisor at Chiron Medical and Galos Technologies. Previously, she spent almost 20 years as a diplomat in the British Foreign Office with postings covering Madrid, New Delhi and San Francisco. Priya is a member of the International Committee at the Royal Academy of Engineering, Ashridge Associate Faculty Member at Holt International Business School, Senior Independent Director at Badminton GB, and advisor at Tech London and Global Tech Advocates at the Youth Advocate Group. Priya, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ollie. And you'll feel free to take a breath now because that's a ridiculously long intro. Apologies for that.
Well, it's an amazing collection of roles that you have built. Talk me through how you've approached that.
Well, I think one thing that I was really struggling with in my role working for government is that you're always only seeing things from one lens. You're only seeing things from the perspective of one entity, one group of stakeholders. And as much as you try and get into the mindset of the other people who might be interested in that issue, it's really hard to do that unless you're actually sitting at the table in the middle of the conversation. So one of the things that I had always been interested in doing, and I managed to do after having left the diplomatic service and then worked for a few years for a San Francisco business here in the UK, was do that switch to portfolio because it gave me that opportunity to actually really sit in the shoes of all of the different people and stakeholders who were involved in the technology ecosystem, which is where I wanted to spend my time.
Do you think you would have had the opportunity and the success you've enjoyed with your board career if you'd not had that San Francisco posting, or was that a sliding doors moment?
I think it was a sliding doors moment, but perhaps for a different reason, because in my career to date, up until I was posted to San Francisco, I hadn't really worked extensively on technology. I'd worked on more classic issues of diplomacy, European Union policy. My first job in the Foreign Office was on common fisheries policy. I'm actually the one person who's done fish in the Foreign Office. So you don't have experiences that were broader than really the more classic world of foreign policy. But when I went to San Francisco, obviously that role, you're sitting at the heart of Silicon Valley. And by the end of 5 years there, I was absolutely sure that what I wanted to do next was stay in the world of technology.
When you made that decision, what was that first step for you?
Well, I think as probably my experience parallels others, that you start with one role and then you build on another role and then you build on another role. And by the end of it, you've got this portfolio out of nowhere that you weren't necessarily planning or expecting. In my case, that started with the venture partner role that I took on at Merian Ventures. In parallel to that, I was on the Council of Innovate UK, which is the UK government's innovation agency, now part of UKRI, but at that point was separate. And so I started to build on sort of 2 or 3 different things and then roll on to today. What that's translated to is a portfolio of roles across government, across investment, across startups and across PLCs, which tries, at least in my head, to look at sort of lots of different elements to the technology ecosystem.
I don't think we've had a guest in the past who's transitioned like that. And actually think about it, that's a really smart way to do it, because by taking on that investor director role, you're getting exposed to the board role and building up a lot of relevant expertise. Was it hard finding that investor director role at Merian?
It's all about relationships, I think. And one of the things that really comes through in board opportunities is about your network, making sure that you're connected to your network. You stay connected to people who you might have met a few years ago, because people come around again in your world and your cycle of things that you're interested in. And so for me, it was actually an old relationship that I had from San Francisco days, and they were looking to have somebody based in the UK and were willing to consider me for that role. So it was very fortuitous. But I think that lesson is really applicable much more broadly, which is ultimately when you're doing portfolio, your brand is you. And so you really have to spend time to build your network, to really build and add value to relationships around you. You have to be prepared. Maybe I've spent too much time in California, but I think to do that Californian thing and pay it forward, be a valuable asset to the broader ecosystem around you, because at some point karma will work out and something will come back your way. I'm a firm believer in that's how it happens.
One of the themes that has emerged from past podcast guests is that being really clear about what differentiates you versus other potential candidates. I've heard you, whilst I was researching, talk about technology and connectivity as being your domains of expertise. Did that play out for you in the way that you went about interviewing for roles?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, it's quite unusual to have somebody whose background is in diplomacy working in technology. I can probably list off the sort of 5 or 10 people who I know who've done a similar thing. It's a small world of us. And so definitely that's a USP, somebody who works and understands government, but also understands geopolitics and geopolitical framing, but is not only looking backwards to the world of historical diplomacy, but actually looking forwards to the world of a technology-driven and inspired world where dynamics are going to be very different. And so, to your point, defining that as my USP relatively early was a very clear way to demonstrate value add to people who probably look at the CV of someone like me and really struggle to understand how you might fit in.
You've got an amazing range of board roles covering the full spectrum. And just to sort of tease out some of the lessons you've learned from that, maybe can we start with some of your listed boards? So at Reach, you face some interesting challenges, including pension obligations, legal challenging, restructuring, and AI implementation. Could you just talk us through how you've navigated each of those challenges and the lessons you've taken from them?
So I think when you sit on a board, there's going to be areas that are your specialist subjects, and there's going to be areas where you're looking at an issue fresh, and actually your role as a board member is to get up to speed. So good board papers are really important so that you can understand the history of an issue, but also the pros and cons. But I do think there's a great amount of value in someone coming in with fresh eyes. So on the issues that you talked through, obviously in a board discussion, you will have people around that table who have specific experience of dealing with exactly that issue and theme, perhaps in other roles, perhaps in other non-exec roles. But you'll also have people who come to an issue fresh and are getting up to speed by what they're presented with in the board papers. And I think what that creates is a really rich discussion, actually, because it's a discussion both of people who are questioning the substance from their own experience. So being able to do that expert critique, but also people, and in many of the issues that you raised as examples of Reach discussions, it's probably the role that I play, which is coming in as a fresh set of eyes with maybe a different perspective and giving a different type of challenge. So in a board discussion, you need that combination of deep expertise who can challenge on the substance, but also strategic thinkers who will come in from maybe a different perspective. And the combination of those, I think, provides the richest discussion around a board table.
Can we talk a bit about your role at Herald Investment Trust? Slightly different, obviously, being an investment trust from an operating company. I'm always fascinated to hear what fund managers see as the value they get from their board. What do you think if we had Katie Potts, who's the fund manager at HIT, on the podcast? What will she say is the value she gets from the board and you as a board member?
I think you have to ask Katie, but I suspect, or at least I hope, what she would say is that the reason they wanted to recruit somebody with my profile is because they wanted somebody who had a different profile. They wanted to break out of the world of people who had deep experience in investment trusts, of which we are really fortunate to have a number on the Herald board, but actually bring in somebody who had, I suppose, two different sets of skills and experiences. One was that experience of working with and alongside government and understanding how government might relate to the financial sector. But secondly, also somebody who lives and breathes technology. Herald invests in technology companies. So actually having someone at the board table who is also deeply embedded in the world of technology and understands the direction of travel for future technologies, particularly in a global context, not just the UK context, I'd like to think is a real value add, but you'll have to ask Katie whether she agrees with me.
It's a big focus right now for boards, the direction of technology, and obviously lots of buzz around the whole AI, LLM impact. As a board member who is deeply involved in that technology world, how do you think about that space?
So I would say there's a few things that boards should be thinking about in the world of technology. I think there shouldn't be a non-executive these days who is not spending a bit of time upskilling themselves in the world of technology, even if it's not their day job. I think, though, there's also a risk that boards get down a rabbit hole of super exciting new technology. And I can talk quantum technology with the best next person, but actually the reality is that's not going to be something that affects most companies in the time frame within which a board is really focused. Where actually boards can really help is thinking about the application of current technologies to a business, and also where might technology come in and disrupt a business model in the near term. And that is the conversation that I think is really, really valuable to businesses at the moment, because the wave of technology that we're seeing is a wave that is happening at such fast pace that actually you really, really need to be able to contextualize the direction of travel for the company that you're trying to help and support as a non-exec in that framing of where technology will go. You talked in the beginning, Ollie, about large language models. That is the conversation we're having day in, day out about AI. But actually, for some companies, the conversation doesn't need to be about large language models and how they're going to affect the company. It could be about actually how you improve your data analysis by putting machine learning as part of the framing for how your company analyzes and takes insights from the data it manages. That's an AI thing, just as much as generative large language models are AI. But we tend to get very distracted as society into the conversation about large language models and not about how we can actually use technology in a very practical way to make real differences to current businesses. It's really, for me, about not getting obsessed with the most exciting futuristic technologies as a board, but actually thinking through how real world technologies that are able to be used today can make a difference to the business model of the company that you're operating in.
You talked earlier about the importance of reading around technology. From a practical perspective, for a board member who doesn't have a spike in technology, what would you recommend they should be reading?
MIT review, Massachusetts Institute of Technology review that comes out with insights of technology. Frankly, most mainstream broadsheets now will talk about technology with varying degrees of credibility. I'm always an FT Weekend person for a bit more insightful reading. But podcasts are always great. And most people have a bit of time when they're commuting, when they're walking the dog or whatever it is. And podcasts can be a great way to get up to speed. So thinking about issues like the Andreessen Horowitz podcast, A16Z podcast that comes out with lots of sort of discussions around technology. All of those are really good ways just to get familiar, just get a little bit of understanding about how the world is changing and hopefully find issues of interest that then you can take back to the boardroom.
We've talked about your listed company roles. Can we talk a little bit about your government roles? Because you've got a couple there with UKRI and as the SID at Digital Catapult. Could you do a bit of a compare-contrast for me for someone who doesn't have experience of both of those?
Well, they differ quite substantively in that actually the UKRI is an arm's length body of government. So it's directly funded by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, whereas actually Digital Catapult is a private sector classified organisation with part funding from government, but also part funding from other sources as well. Both of them are working around the government ecosystem. And I think that is very, very interesting because it gives you that seat at the centre of policy making and understanding what the direction of travel is on the issues you care about. The reality is there's lots and lots of different roles that you could have as a board member within government. You can be a board member of a Whitehall department, for example. But there's a difference in whether some of those are more advisory and some of those are more structured. In the context of UK research and innovation, we are fortunate actually to have a PLC board chair, Andrew Mackenzie, who, and unsurprisingly, that board is chaired with a great degree of professionalism akin to that of a PLC board because of the size of the organisation and the budget responsibility that it manages. So there's lots of different types of boards, but I think the one thing I would want anyone listening to this to take away is just to dig into those and understand where you might be able to play a role in government, because alongside the central departments, there are lots and lots of different arm's length bodies. Some might be paid roles, some might be unpaid roles, but they're all going to be really fascinating roles that you can contribute to as an individual. Do you find you getting a lot of insight from those that end up informing your other roles, or what is the driver for you? I think for me personally, having been involved in government for 20 years, it's really nice not to feel completely removed from the world of government. But actually, the reality is you have to be quite careful when you have multiple hats of making sure you're not inappropriately using information that you've garnered from one role in another role. Nevertheless, I think the reality is when you're working across lots of different hats in this addressing the same problem, you definitely improve as an individual in terms of your generic knowledge base and your ability to contribute. So there's always a sort of learning cycle, I would say, from having lots of different roles, because you will ultimately be having discussions, not confidential discussions, but, just general discussions that allow you to learn, allow you to get better as a board member, and hopefully therefore be able to contribute more effectively either in that role or frankly in other roles. Let's talk a bit about your role at Merian. What do you see through that role in terms of the way boards operate in those earlier stage businesses? So startup boards, first of all, they are created at not necessarily the point of inception of a startup, but at a point where it looks like that startup might be actually going places. Most startup, in my experience at least, start with some sort of advisory group of individuals, either preconception and then super early stage, and then relatively early realize that part of this path to maturity is actually bringing on a board. But at that point, for a startup, a board is really two things, I would say. One, it's your investors. So the people who've put the money into you at an early stage rightly have strong views about how you may develop the business, and are also hopefully people who can provide value add to your business by connecting you with other individuals. And so having them engaged as a board member is a good way to get that support from them on a day-to-day basis. But in addition to that, I think startups also tend to want to do a very different thing to PLC boards or larger scale boards, which is bring in very focused expertise. So they will be looking at the next problem that they have to solve, and how do I bring in someone who's encountered that problem before and therefore can help me at a very granular level work through how I address that problem. So it could be, how do you develop product market fit, for example? And actually what you want as a startup, if that's the big next challenge for you, is someone who has struggled with exactly that question in their own company. So to do that, compare and contrast, for me at least, means that startup boards are very, very different to larger company boards or indeed large organization boards in government, because they will inevitably end up with that combination of quite specific sectorally focused skills, and then their investors who have a very particular interest in that company's success.
I'm interested to dig down a little bit into the Merian strategy, where you're cultivating talent and technology that might otherwise be overlooked by actively supporting female founders and co-founders as they scale their businesses and continue to deliver on their potential. And as the CEO of a female-founded business, I'm really interested to hear how you see that strategy playing out and how it changes the way that you operate.
For me, it is absolutely fundamental that we have investors who are thinking through that lens, because we all know the statistics. We know that from a gender perspective, female founders are getting significantly less investment than their peers in the market. And this has a huge effect on the whole cycle of scale and growth and recycling of profits back into future companies. So whilst we're only ever going to be able to be a small piece of the equation in terms of addressing that, I think it's fundamentally important that there are organizations who are actively going out to find founders who have brilliant ideas and have brilliant teams and are themselves brilliant, but who just don't necessarily have the same access to funding as their peers. And that is stopping them being able to take their company from zero to hero. And that's really, really important. So it's something that we need to do more of as a society.
What is blocking the pure capital markets flow? If there are these sort of opportunities out there, why is capital not more freely flowing to those opportunities? And what do you think a board member listening to this can do to tap into that opportunity?
I think there's two different questions there. So there are systemic problems in our economy that mean that money is not distributed fairly. I'm not going to start some sort of Marxist philosophy on the effective distribution of capital, but the reality is we know that there are systemic problems, and that as a result of those systemic biases in how we operate our economy, underrepresented founders in the broader sense. So we've talked about gender, but that could be ethnicity. It could be, a founder who's building a brilliant company, but they happen to be based in the north of England. Those are major challenges in terms of having the same access to capital as other peers. The second part of the question in terms of how that relates to a board member and how board members need to think about it is that I think it's really, really important for board members always to have that sort of prism of thinking about inclusivity and how they're operating. Now that applies on one sense to something like people management. So how are we making sure that the company or the organization that you're the non-executive of is thinking appropriately about routes to career progression for underrepresented groups, or just providing that extra level of insight and questioning around the data that a board is presented with around inclusion and diversity. But I think the really, really important piece, and I can't emphasize this enough, Ollie, is why that matters. And, for me, it always comes back to the point that we're not doing this because of CSR. As a board member, you shouldn't be thinking about this because, you think it's your job as a board member to look at a tick box distribution of gender, ethnicity and regional diversity or social inclusion. You actually should be doing it as a board member because you know that if you have a diverse group of opinions at the table, the decisions you take will be better, and therefore the company that you have a responsibility to will perform better as a business. And it's really striking how often the second part of that gets lost and people end up focusing on the CSR bit, as I call it.
One of the things that concerns me is there seems to be quite a split in the board audience between those who are advocates of diversity and those who are silent resistors. One of the arguments I'll hear from some of the silent resistors is, well, there are lots of different ways that you can be diverse as a board, which are the most relevant, and actually the things being put forward around whether it's gender or ethnicity or socioeconomic is not necessarily the most relevant thing to any given board at a time. What's the retort to that line of argument?
I think the retort is that it's not a zero-sum game. If you as a board member are thinking that actually this particular characteristic is something I've never seen in this organization, and we really need to make sure that we're not somehow excluding individuals with this particular characteristic to be recruited or thrive in this organization, then 100% you should be raising that. You should be talking about it. I think the challenge is that when that comes at the expense of programs or initiatives to support other characteristics, the reality is we need all of those characteristics in the mix to make something work. And so my retort purely and simply is just, it's not a zero-sum game.
You've also got an incredibly rich advisory portfolio alongside your non-exec roles. And lots of the people that I speak with are often set on getting fiduciary board roles. And often it's at listed companies. And I sometimes scratch my head and think, why would you want to be have all the fiduciary responsibility of a listed company? Could you do a compare contrast in how you think about those advisory versus fiduciary roles?
I have two quite different advisory roles. One is as an advisor to a company. So in effect, I work directly to the co-founders and the senior leadership team of the business, helping them with specific issues. In that case, it was a strategic government comms type advisory function that they were looking for. The second case, it was to join an advisory board for a new company. So they're quite different, actually, in terms of the role that you might play, because an advisory board to a smaller company, to a startup, in my case, can operate a little bit like a board, and that without the fiduciary responsibilities, you're bringing a group of people together on a regular basis to contribute suggestions, understand your direction of travel, give their input, advice, make connections and introductions, and all the sorts of things that a board may also help you with. So there's that element to it. Whereas the other advisory role that I have is very much working directly with the team to help the team on specific issues that they don't necessarily have the breadth of skills and expertise to do themselves.
Okay, now you talked about the value of doing pro bono roles. You do sit on the board of Badminton GB. Given how much you've got on, I'm fascinated to know, why did you make space for this one?
I have always loved the sport of badminton. I played it growing up. I played it for my university, and you will know this, but maybe not all of your audience do, that actually the world of sports governance is a whole other world that I frankly didn't even know existed until I saw this role being advertised and applied for it. So lots of the sporting organisations across the UK and indeed globally will have their own governance structures and will have a combination of non-execs or advisors who support that sport in its growth. Now, in the case of badminton, I had that personal interest. I saw an advert. And so I thought, why not? It's something different to do. And I'm somebody, as you'll have gathered, who, likes having a variety of interests. And it's slightly left field from everything else that I do. And that it's quite fun. It's quite interesting to learn something new, get involved in a whole new world, and actually build up a skill set in something that you haven't got a skill set in already. So that's how I ended up as a senior independent director at the GB Badminton.
I was recently talking with a few board members of sports organisations, and they were expressing some frustration about the challenges of their boards because they've experienced it firsthand, has strong opinions often on how these things should be done, even if they haven't got necessarily a deep experience, if that makes sense. So there tend to be what someone described to me recently as a horse, highly opinionated, but rarely supports with evidence, which is one of my new favourite expressions. Have you experienced any of that? Not necessarily on Badminton UK, but I imagine you talk with others on sports boards.
That's where sports boards are no different to other boards. The chair is fundamental. So having a good chair who knows how to plan and moderate a discussion effectively and bring it to conclusion is really important. A chair who understands the personalities they've got around the table is also really important. But also, I think that's where you need to build a board that is genuinely different and can contribute different things in the same way that we've talked about in the context of a large organization board or a large company board. What you don't want in a sports board is your board of 6 or 7 people being comprised of 6 ex-players and one person who knows accounts. That's going to bring a lot of, quite specific opinions to the table, particularly opinions of people who maybe played the sport 20 years ago and might not be up to speed with what's happening now. So I think the same premise of just bringing different skills and experiences is absolutely applicable for sports boards, just as it is for any other board.
Priya, time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Go for it.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I have one on the theme of inclusion, Ollie. There's a great book called The No Club. It's a book that is based around the story of 4 women. I think 3 of them were academics, 1 wasn't. But 4 friends who realized that actually their whole working life experience was as women in the workplace being pulled in lots of different directions and not being able to focus on the things that in their own career were deemed as the criteria for promotional success. And so actually they then did extensive research around this and actually looked at how women in every workplace were essentially unfairly burdened by non-promotable work. And so the lesson from a board perspective is actually how do you bring out these subconscious biases in how our system operates, whether that's an academic institution, whether that's a company, and actually think of those when you're thinking about inclusion. Because the reality is, I hope in this day and age, you're not going to encounter lots of visible bias, but there'll be lots of entrenched bias in the system. And that's what you need to spot.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
People talking over other people and not listening to what somebody else has said. Boardrooms work really, really well when board members are building off each other's interventions and not just coming to the table with their entrenched opinion that they've probably always had and always will have. Actually, boards work really well when one person says something and then that sparks a thought in somebody else and you have a sort of genuinely sort of cumulative discussion that ends up helping you reach a good conclusion.
Most valuable board ritual?
There's no weird shamanic rituals that I can share with you, sadly, Ollie, but I think the one that I really do value is closed NED time at the end of every meeting where possible, because obviously, if you don't need it, you can always scrap it. It's the end of the meeting, it's fine. But it does give you space as a board, as a collective to reflect. And that moment of reflection can be quite powerful in sort of understanding and looking for the very big lessons that you need to take out of the discussion you've just had.
Most significant professional insight? The
world is changing really fast and you don't have to be an expert in technology. But if you're not learning about what might come at us, then you're really not doing your service as a board member.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
It's not something that was ever said to me, but I do think the question of authenticity is so important. And what really makes me squirm is when people are trying to fit into the box that they think they should be placed in and not actually being their authentic self at a board meeting or frankly any other context. You don't have to be somebody else. You're being brought into that board, that group, that advisory role because of what you bring to the table.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think it's when you're sitting on the executive side of the table, it is sometimes actually quite hard to really understand what a board does. And so for me, it was less changing my opinion of a board, but actually demystifying the concept somewhat and realizing that they are a fundamental part of the governance structure of any organization, but also that a good board, and we should have very good boards around us in this day and age, knows where to stop and where the executive restarts. And I think that's the really key decision point that a chair needs to, and a CEO needs to be able to recognize.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
You get the scars, don't you, after being in lots of different contexts and discussions, and that makes you a better person. I said earlier in the discussion, Ollie, I'm someone who loves learning constantly, but I learn from observing. I learn from sort of seeing how people do things well, seeing how people do things badly. And so definitely having now done a portfolio career for coming up for 5 years now, it really is a learning journey where you are picking new things up every day and hopefully finding ways to change for the better as a person and as a contributor to that discussion and bring something new to the table.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Please don't think about a non-executive career as the thing you do as the last thing in life. It's something that you can do at lots of different points in your career journey. When you've got a good amount of exec experience, you can bring real value to the table. I think secondly, listen. Listening is the biggest skill that you can ever have as a board member, and that will really make you able to contribute in a different way. And last but not least, it's please think about inclusion because of the better performance of the business or organization you're working with rather than a tick box of the CSR exercise.
That has been a masterful overview of an amazing range of portfolio roles. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience with us.
Thank you for having me, Ollie. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope your audience enjoyed it.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Role Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing, smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newrole.com to find out more.